Hey, Amanda.
Hey, Marissa.
How are you?
I'm hanging in there. How about yourself?
I'm doing good. Today, we're going to talk the first of probably many, many conversations about the subject of epilepsy. Today, we wanted to talk a little bit about our initial experiences with epilepsy. I know in the United States, 1 in 26 people are affected by epilepsy. What did you know or not know, or what was your experience with epilepsy before you had Ava?
I did not know much about epilepsy. I knew epilepsy existed, was a medical condition. I had no idea that infants could have seizures. And I maybe might have known one or two people growing up that managed seizures, but I was pretty naive to the entire landscape of seizure versus epilepsy. I
Yeah,
had no clue it couldn't be treated, right? That it could be
right.
refractory. I think that was my first, like, one, a baby can have this, but two, you're telling me you have all of this knowledge about the human body and you don't understand epilepsy.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
How about you?
well, I had an uncle, or I have an uncle who has epilepsy, but it's pretty controlled, it's pretty managed. And otherwise, I don't think I really knew anybody, certainly not when I was little. As I got older, I had a friend in high school whose father has epilepsy. Again, relatively well controlled. But like you said, I didn't realize you couldn't get seizures under control. I didn't realize they were sometimes so hard to control. And I did not know that people lived with daily seizure activity, right? I had
Yeah.
no idea that that was some
Yeah.
people's experience.
I mean, I guess I knew, or I felt like it was usually an emergency if it was
Right.
unexpected, right? That call 911, that kind of stuff. I understood not to stick something in someone's mouth.
Yeah. You had that visual of that one type of seizure, which is
Yeah.
like a tonic-clonic seizure. I had no awareness that there were other types of seizures that
Yeah.
you could have,
And that
honestly.
you could have multiple types at the same time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, how did Gregory get his epilepsy diagnosis?
Well, he started doing these weird things. He was 4 weeks old. He did this really weird thing where I was actually sitting with him. So he's a newborn, right? He's 4 weeks old. It was May. It was kind of warm for May. It was like in the upper 70s. My father was at my house helping me when I was having help in those like newborn days, and my father
Mhm.
was there with me, and it was really beautiful out. So we were sitting out on the deck, and Gregory was sleeping and I was holding him, and all of a sudden all 4 of his limbs were doing this sort of repetitive jolting, and I'm looking at him and looking at my father, and like, something is not right here. And I got up, I called the pediatrician's number. By the time they answered, it was over. He was back to sleep, and I said, "He just did this thing." And they said, "Okay, well, if he does it again, try and get it on video." So I said, "Okay." And of course, he did do it again. And I was able to capture on video. He was actually doing two sort of things. He was doing that jumping thing with his limbs, like during sleep. And then he was doing this thing where his arms would be really stiff at his sides, and he would turn his little head and he would make this sort of like murmuring sound. So I brought all those videos to the pediatrician, and the jumping one, he was sort of like, "I don't know." But the one where his arms were straight and he had his head to the side and he was doing this like murmuring, the pediatrician was like, "Yeah, there's something strange is there. So I'm going to send you to neurologist." So I said, "Okay." So we had our first neurology appointment when he was like 6 weeks old or something like that. And I showed the neurologist the videos, and he requested us to do a 1 hour EEG. So we went to do the 1 hour EEG. He didn't have any episodes during the EEG. So when it was over and we got the report back, the doctor said, "Oh, everything looks okay." So they're great. He's not having seizures. Everything's great, you know? And then it was like a couple weeks later where he was doing those things, but he was doing them like every hour. So I called the neurologist and I said, "He's doing these things. He's doing them like way more." And they said, "Why don't you take him to the emergency room?" So we went to the emergency room, and he was doing it in the emergency room. And the emergency room doctor said something about seizures. And I said, "Oh, he doesn't have seizures." Right? Because that's what I remembered from the
Right.
1 hour EEG. Everything looks good. He doesn't have seizures. And the ER doctor was like, okay, no, we're going to hook him up and we'll see. And of course, they hooked him up to an EEG, and he was having seizures. So he got his epilepsy diagnosis as like a 2.5 month old, something like that. And I remember thinking, well, first of all, being devastated, but it didn't cross my mind that there wouldn't be a treatment for it. It did not cross my mind. They sent us home on Keppra, and it did help, but it didn't stop them completely. And that was, we lived with an epilepsy diagnosis until 6 months old when we got the CDKL5 results back. Was that similar to your experience with Ava?
No. Not at all. Ava was about 7 months old before I saw her having a seizure. She was my first child, and there were some things that might have clued me in had she been my second. But, Ava, she didn't latch well in the hospital. She had some extended jaundice. She'd flunked her left ABR. So it took us a couple weeks to, go back and retest the ABR to get her breastfeeding well and to kind of get moving on into motherhood and getting to know each other and meeting her needs. So by 4 months old, she was rolling and doing some of the milestones she should have been doing. Nothing really seemed completely off to me, but my pediatrician, or her pediatrician, actually was a family doctor. He asked me at the 4 month appointment, he said, "Amanda, do you think she can see?" And I was like, "What?" And, I hadn't thought of it much. I didn't, she would bat at things, had one of those little play mats. And so she would use her arms. But I was like, well, I mean, I don't know. He's like, when she looks at me, she's not looking at me. And he's like, when we come back at 6 months, we can talk about that. And so left me thinking, well, maybe that is not quite right. We went to the Virgin Islands when she was 6 months old. And so I put her 6 month appointment off a little bit. And I had weaned her from breastfeeding to go to the Virgin Islands. So we hung out there for a week with some friends, and a gentleman asked me, he was like, "She's so quiet." He's like, "I have never seen a baby who's so good." And I was like, and she was still quite, I could lay her down and she wasn't rolling everywhere. She could roll, she could move, but I felt fine laying her down, on a deck and not, hovering over her. So I kind of thought, well, geez, that's the second person who's been like, your baby is not acting like babies I've been around. So fast forward to the 6 month appointment, and he referred us to EI for vision and also for PT. So we had been referred to EI before her first seizure started. And
That's early intervention, EI,
that's early
early
intervention.
intervention.
Yeah, EI. I just was so clueless. It wasn't like I had rushed to do it. And then it was Memorial Day, and I had laid her on the floor to nap. And her dad was sleeping on a couch very, close to us. We were in the basement where there was a TV, and I had sit down to just watch some TV or something. And all of a sudden, she burst into like a seizure. And it, in hindsight, it was a cluster of spasms. Went on and on. It felt like forever, right? And I was trying to wake her dad up, and he wasn't waking up. And I was like, what am I supposed to do here? It ended, and she seemed fine. So I called and left a message at her doctor's office, and they called me back and essentially were like, if that happens again, try to get it on film. I actually took her in. They asked me to bring her in. I brought her in the day after the holiday, and they just did a quick overview to make sure she wasn't having any health situations or anything that maybe could explain it. You have to understand that we didn't have cell phones that recorded things well. This was like early 2006. So our little point and click cameras could take some video, and you could put it on a jump drive and take it to a doctor's office. I think it was like 3 days later, I was sitting on the floor with her, and I figured out that they were happening when she was going to sleep, and that oftentimes auditory stimulation would provoke them. Like my furnace would click on, and that would like send her into a seizure. So I caught an episode finally on camera, and it went on and on and on. And she never lost oxygen. We didn't have hypoxia. There was no blue lips. There was nothing that indicated like, like this is like call 911. This is an emergency. I'm busy trying to film this thing. And so I got it on camera, got it over to it was a CD actually that I copied it onto. And this took time to like this is data, it's big file. So got it, took it to her pediatrician. He called me immediately. He was like, I have never seen anything like this. And he's like, I sent it to Children's Hospital and they want to see you. I was like, okay. So somebody from Children's Hospital called me and they set up an appointment and they were like, we can see you in 7 months. And I was like,
Oh my
what?
gosh.
And in the meantime, they prescribed phenobarbital for her. They thought the phenobarbital would probably take care of things until we seen them in 7 months. But we put her on pheno and it seemed to make things worse. Like either that or it's just the coincidence of the epilepsy progression. So these things start happening all the time and they upperdose and upperdose and upperdose. And it's just making things worse, it seems. So they ended up getting her in on a satellite campus site with a neurologist who quite frankly had no clue about seizures or anything of that nature. But what they did want to do was get her hooked up to an EEG and do a CT scan to make sure she didn't have a brain tumor. So, we had a 30-minute EEG, hooked her up. They ruled out any kind of brain malformations that might be causing it, and they adjusted her meds and sent me home again and wanted me to come back in a certain amount of time for another 30-minute EEG. And that was really, it was like your kid has seizures and they're like hard to control, it appears, but maybe putting her on this new medication will help. And that's kind of where we were left. She was almost 8 months old. And that was that for the diagnostic aspect of epilepsy.
Mhm.
It took us almost 7 years to get a CDKL5 diagnosis. So within that time, we had a lot of epilepsy. We had a lot of EEGs. We had a lot of provider changes and a lot of med changes in the greater Denver metropolitan area, the Anschutz campus where University of Colorado CU Medicine is located. I think Ava was like 4 when they opened that campus. That's really the first time it felt like we were in a monitoring unit.
Well, what is an epilepsy monitoring unit?
Yeah, an epilepsy monitoring unit has a specific one. They have specific types of equipment with specific expertise, right? So Denver is a level 4, which is the most comprehensive, and then a level 3 and 4 should be able to really tackle the most severe cases of epilepsy. I would like to think that in this day and age, any infant having a seizure is referred to a level 3 or 4 unit at least once, no matter where they're located in the US. But I'm sure that's not 100% the case, but hopefully.
It's funny how you get to know the techs. When you have a lot of
Mhm.
EEGs, you get to know the techs who put the EEG on. And we used to have this kid, and I remember his name because his name is Adam. That's my son's middle name. And so we used to see Adam, and we'd say, Adam, we're back for another EEG. Of course, Gregory's a baby. And I remember I asked him one time as he's putting the leads on, have you ever put one on yourself? Like during practice, like when you were learning how to do this, did you ever put one on yourself? You know how like in nursing school, they make you give the shots to yourself or blood draw
Yeah.
yourself, whatever. I'm like, do you ever do it to yourself? And he said, I'll never forget it. No, I haven't because I don't want to know what it says. I thought that was
Oh,
really interesting.
well,
It's like,
yeah.
I
I
don't want
mean,
to know what
yeah.
it says.
I mean, it is quite archaic and they really don't understand it's a tool they have, but it's hard. It's almost hard to fathom that we haven't come up with any better technology to do this stuff. But,
Well, I think,
I mean, go ahead.
I was just going to think, I think he was thinking, you know, it could be jarring to be told something if you're not. See, we're at a point, and you are too, I think, where you're treating your clinical seizure, like you're treating what you're seeing. You're not getting on the EEG to make treatment decisions, obviously, because we haven't been on EEG in years. You're treating what you're seeing. And so I think for him to say, I don't want to know, is because what he's seeing seems okay. So if I put that on and it says, hey, it makes you think about
Yeah, your
yourself.
brain's got funny activity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I did during all them 30 minutes. Like you make me think, get to know our tech on this North Campus where we would go. And she was fantastic. And it was hard to do these EEGs. And, a lot of the time, like, how am I going to get her to sleep? Having to try to sleep. Like, there was so much to it. And I was always really worried that we were bad patients. And so I asked her, what's your worst EEG case? And she told me, she says, Amanda, I have performed an EEG on a man with an axe in his head. And I was like, what?
My gosh.
And she said, care how loud she is or what happens. She's like, there's much harder patients to deal with. And I was like, okay, that kind of, set me up to the idea that, these guys, they see a lot of crazy stuff that
Yeah.
I just can't probably imagine.
There's so much learning that you do. When you have an infant that has epilepsy, it's chaos, right? It's
Yeah.
chaos. Nobody is expecting this is what's going to happen. You are not expecting this is what's going to happen. You have a new baby, which is chaos in itself. And now you're dealing with all of this extra stuff, extra appointments, EEGs, documenting seizures, taking videos. I can't even tell you how many videos, if I go back to my camera folder from 2016, how many seizure videos I
Seizure
have
videos.
of him. It's really sad. It breaks your heart. You remember
Mhm.
what it was like to witness that. I mean, it's still hard to witness his seizures now, but no, when you have a newborn and an infant and you're trying to manage an epilepsy diagnosis, especially when they've started to medicate your child and it's not fixing the problem, um it's really overwhelming and you feel like you're adrift with no anchors, right? And I remember
Yes.
you just are at the mercy of the ocean, right? You're at the
Yeah.
mercy of the environment. And I remember they started my son on Keppra, and then shortly after, because I would call them every week. I remember doing this. I always documented his seizures, and at the end of the week I would call them and I would say, "This is how many seizures he's had." Because I'm looking for, like, what are you guys going to do about it?
Mhm.
And they're sort of like, they don't know what to do about it. And so eventually, at some point, I can't remember when, they added a second medication. And that medication, every week when I would call and say, this is how many seizures they had, they would say, well, let's increase that medication. And we probably spent like 6 months doing that. And that is a lesson that I have learned looking back, is that if we add a medication, I always ask our doctor now, how long do you anticipate till we see if this is going to be helpful or not? And if we get to that point and it's not helpful, maybe we try and increase it. If it were at the goal dose and it's not helpful, I quickly sort of say, all right, well, this is not the one now. I didn't know to do that back then. So we have went all this time just increasing, increasing, increasing. It was topiramate, increasing, 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 had no effect at all. And it actually impacted his appetite. So I was struggling to get him to finish his bottles. But that's a lesson that I have learned, is ask the question about when they expect to see if it's going to make a difference, and then pay attention so that you're not indefinitely playing with a medication that is
Isn't
not
working.
going to do anything. Like, it's a waste of your time.
Well, it's interesting because we were put on phenobarbital right away over the phone, and what we moved to from phenobarbital was Topamax, and I was really resistant to add more than one medication. It wasn't suggested at that time, right? But even like putting her on one while taking her off one was a new concept to me. But I would do the same thing, and they would have me increase the medication, and we got to a dose where, quite frankly, she wasn't having at least visual seizures. She was not having seizures we could see, but her dose of Topamax was so high she was dopey. And in hindsight, when we took her off the Topamax, like, she kind of woke up, like she sat up even right away, motor wise. So you have to trust your gut, and you also have to learn how to form a relationship with your provider. And, it was hard for me to trust that they knew better than I did about the big picture and the goals and the way this stuff works or doesn't work, or the things they're looking at that may or may not be a positive. So
Well,
I,
nobody ever explains to you. I don't think I heard the term epileptologist until years after Gregory was diagnosed. Like, nobody, there is so much that the doctors don't explain to you as a parent.
yeah,
And I mean, that was one thing that I had no idea. Our pediatrician referred us to a neurologist. We saw a neurologist. Our first neurologist was, I'm sure, a very smart guy. He was very kind. He was very quiet. And so it was a situation where if you had a question, you could ask him and he would give you an answer, but you had to know a question to ask him. Otherwise, he was very quiet. And the first time that we were in the hospital with Gregory for seizures, he was in the monitoring unit. the attending doctor on the floor of the hospital was the one who came to talk to us. So it wasn't our neurologist, it was this other person who was an epileptologist. And I didn't know that at the time. And she came in and she sat with me. Gregory's got the EEG on, he's in the crib jail, the hospital crib jail. And I'm sitting there and she comes to talk to me. And she is a talker. She's like, this is what, this is this, this is this. She's just talking. She was not quiet. And I was like, this is excellent. So I said to her, I really like how you do this, that you're telling me things, because then I can have questions. You know what I mean? You hear
Mhm.
things, now I have questions. And I can ask my questions, and she's forthcoming with information. And I said to her, could you be my son's neurologist? And she said, sure. I mean, they're all in the same practice. She said,
Right.
sure. And I said, is that, I don't want to offend the other guy, but this is a much better fit for me, This is a much
Yeah.
better fit. But then I learned she's an epileptologist, which the other person wasn't. So it's a better fit anyway.
I think it's complex. They don't have that much time to spend with us in a room, right? So, what I learned is I need to have goals of what I want to do when I come into an appointment. So if I have a chance to see a specialist, whether it's, epilepsy or GI or whoever, what are the three things I want to accomplish, right? Because we really probably only have time to dive into three things without having to do follow up. So, like, why am I there? What do I want to change? And how do I want to change that or not? And not that I have the answers, but we get to be better patients. It's just a lot. It's hard to find a pediatric neurologist, epileptologist more specifically. It's hard to find an epileptologist, period, outside of these big medical hubs. So there's this fine line between, is it a good fit and do I have other options? So I think never be afraid to seek another option. And never be afraid to be candid. You don't have to be mean, but you can talk about what you're not appreciating, what's not working in the relationship. To manage Ava's epilepsy, things got much better when I formed a longer lasting provider relationship. And
it was hard for me to get to the place of being able to be a real partner with my son's epileptologist, because initially, I don't want to say I was raised, but it's always been my experience in life that you go to the doctor knows what's up, and you listen to the doctor
yep,
and you move on your way and everything's great. That was my whole experience my entire life. The doctor says what to do, you
they
do it,
know
you're
best.
fine. Like, and to have a situation where you're raising this infant with epilepsy, where the reality is nobody knows what to do, because there is no what to do.
Yeah.
There are a myriad of things to try, but nobody knows if it's going to be the thing that helps, if it's going to be a thing that hurts, if it's going to be a neutral thing. Nobody knows. And so in that early first year, when I was with our first doctor, and I would call at the end of the week and they'd say, okay, we'll increase it. We'll increase it. And I'd call and say, this is how many seizures he's having. Okay, we'll increase it. It took me a while to say, hey, this doesn't seem effective, or this
Yeah.
doesn't seem like, to question that, to say, well, how far are we really going? Is there a goal dose? Like, to ask basic questions. Is there a goal dose here? How long do we keep trying this till we try something else? Even ask basic questions. It took me a long time to, one, realize I could ask basic
Yeah.
questions. I'd never questioned doctors before.
Very paternalistic. So, I mean, I didn't like to have questions that were blown off in a way that I felt was more like, you don't need to know that, instead of someone just saying, I really don't know. Like, I don't
Yeah.
know, and I don't know how I would receive that. We didn't have a diagnosis. I would ask them, like, is she going to die? And they would be like, I don't know. And I'm like, well, how long can you have seizures? What does this look like? And they're like, it can go on for a person's entire life. So it can go into adulthood. We don't know. And I was like, all right. So I had a lot of SUDEP education back then. Like, this is the things that are going to be, a problem. But they would tell me I don't know when I asked if she was going to die, but they wouldn't say I don't know when I asked maybe more questions specific to their practice.
Yeah. I have that uncle who has epilepsy. He has that because of cord around his neck at birth. So he had a
Birth injury. Yeah.
oxygen birth injury, whatever.
Hypoxia.
So he has a diagnosis of, well, they always called it mental retardation when I was growing up, but they call it intellectual disability now, right?
Yep.
And so I remember was still back with our first neurologist, my mom came with me to an appointment. Gregory must have been like 4 months old. So we did not have a CDKL5 diagnosis yet. I went with my mother to the neurologist, and I said to the neurologist, I know sometimes when people have epilepsy, like my uncle, they have mental retardation, intellectual disability. Do you think that's what's going to happen to my son? Because at 4 months, he had been referred to early intervention. Also, he wasn't looking, right?
Mhm.
He wasn't never rolling. He didn't was not lifting his head on tummy time. He wasn't doing any of that. He wasn't meeting any milestones. And I said to the doctor, and he said, well, sometimes you have to play the hand you're dealt. That's what he said when I asked him that. Do you think my son's going to have mental retardation? Well, sometimes you have to play the hand you dealt, which of course is like it's a non-answer,
Yeah.
but it's a potentially yes answer. You know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
well, this might not go the way you hope. And I remember crying the whole way home. I feel like I'm always telling stories
Oh.
about myself crying. I cried a lot that first year. I cried a lot that first year. And I remember crying. And my poor mother was like, I don't know if she knew what to make of any of it. Because nobody wants to think your infant is headed for a lifetime of challenge in every aspect.
Yeah.
Um, I was really mad that that's what he said to me. Now I'm sort of over it because I can see, I can see what he meant. I can also see how it's hard because he didn't know for sure what was going on with Gregory. So it's hard to say to a parent, "Hey, yeah,
Maybe.
your baby's in for
It's a
it."
good chance, just
Yeah,
statistically speaking. But
right.
and at that point in time, I was like, gosh, and I'd had like a business degree, so I understood statistics from a business, from my statistics, but I was, can't talk about p values or anything, right? You can't talk about, the standard deviation and how 3 clicks away there is where we were sitting, but it doesn't change things. You're dealt the hand you're dealt, right? And you deal with that. It's not fixable. You really focus on seizures in the early years, and it's hard to make space to think about anything else, and it's hard to imagine that anything else that's coming in the future is not going to be related to you not having the control you think you should have of your seizures. So, I think it might be important that we mention that it's very unlikely, like 80+% of patients with CDD are never going to have seizures controlled.
I think it's interesting what you were saying. Epilepsy takes such a focus that first year because my experience in Gregory's first year is for sure about the epilepsy. But then also there was this developmental piece where he wasn't meeting any milestones. So, we went into early intervention. There was this thought because we did not have the CDKL5 diagnosis, we just had an epilepsy diagnosis and we knew he was behind. There was this thought that if we could get his seizures controlled, he could catch up. And I remember how my husband and I used to talk about different things. And I remember Gregory, he would have a seizure and he'd like void into his diaper. His diaper would be needed to be changed after a seizure. And I remember my husband and I having this conversation like, oh, wow, when he's in school, I wonder if that will be embarrassing to him. Like if he would lose control of his bladder at school if he had a seizure. It didn't occur to me that one, like I was thinking of it as a one-off seizure. Like, oh, if he had like a one-off, so like it didn't occur to me that he'd be in elementary school having daily seizures. That
Th-
was out of my realm of thought. And it didn't occur to me that he wouldn't be potty trained in elementary school. That didn't even occur to me. So my husband and I here are thinking about worrying about his future self in elementary school embarrassment, having no concept that embarrassment is the least of the
That's the
least of his
last.
worries. He's
Yeah.
not worried about that at all. Oh my God.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's where you are at the beginning. Especially when all you have is this epilepsy diagnosis, you don't have your CDKL5 diagnosis yet.
Yeah.
You have this hope and thought if you get seizures controlled, things can be better, things can progress. I didn't realize that wasn't going to be the case until we got our CDKL5 diagnosis. And to be honest, even when we got our CDKL5 diagnosis, it took me a long time to realize still what it was going to be like. It took
Yeah.
me a long time, even with the diagnosis, to realize.
Yeah. It's so hard in them first years to think about anything else but seizures. And I think that's an interesting challenge for people on the outside trying to help us, right? How does this disease progress? And I don't think anybody would ever say, like, "Don't not treat my seizures," but, things become things move along and you have different challenges and you get really good at triaging seizures. You get really good at knowing when it's too long, knowing when you just shouldn't send them to school because they're gonna end up calling you by a certain time. And, I mean, I got really comfortable with that. It was what I knew, and I didn't really want to sometimes I didn't wanna mess with that even when a new med came along that was approved or something.
Yeah.
When you get something that feels like it works and what is manageable, and to me, it was like, can we get through some days without her having to sleep or having a terrible recovery from a seizure? Like, when you can manage something and your expectations, like, can most of the time be met, it can be really hard to make changes, even though, in hindsight, I should have changed a lot of things earlier than I did because once I changed back to the valproic acid, I was like, this is incredible. This medicine works and she's not tired all day and, she can recover from a seizure. And so I encourage newly diagnosed parents to find parents of children of a similar age because you need that. But also lean on the people who have been down this road. And although their advice sometimes might seem cold, it might seem out of touch. You will someday look back like I have at the parents who are 10, 15 years ahead of time and be like, I know what they were talking about. And I know why they told me, don't sweat that, or this is what I would do. Because, there's a lot of individuality within CDKL5, but overall, all of the children I know with CDKL5 still struggle with all of the ADLs. And I shouldn't say children, just humans, adults too. And some of them have more independence in areas than others, but in the long run, you're not going to beat it, right? You have to learn to live with it and not work against it. And I guess that's my little piece of advice. Make friends as friendly as you can with the reality of it, because it's not going away anytime soon, at least.
Yeah. When you think about the early years of Ava's life, like when I reflect on the early years of Gregory's life, I feel like every year of his life there's been ups and downs and decisions that need made,
Hmm.
but not as much as those early years, I don't think. I think those early years, it was a lot of change in the way seizures looked for me, for him, a lot of having to make decisions, seeing something new and having to make a decision. I feel like there was more of that in the
Hmm.
first couple of years than in my most recent years with him. And I'm not sure why that is. It's because infant brains are developing so quickly.
I think so. I think our worst years were like between the age of 3 and 5. They're changing, they're pruning neurons. There's a lot going on. And it's
Yeah.
just, and to the science people out there, you can go read papers about the progression of the EEG in those early years. And it's pretty spot on. I mean, I think most people eventually are like, yeah, that's how it went. Your child may have maybe not as intense of seizure presentation as others, but it's eventually those sneaky seizures find their way back even when you do get a good combo going. So you've got to get used to not being in control, and that's still my mantra to myself, is like, you're not in control of anything but your attitude, your actions and reactions. And so in my
Listen,
head, when I start to really feel overwhelmed, that's where I go, is you're not in control. So, take a deep breath and get a good attitude, because you got to deal with this, whatever this is.
yeah, I think that's a good way to wrap this conversation up, is to say, having an infant with epilepsy that turns out to be a refractory epilepsy, meaning that the likelihood that you're going to get full control of that epilepsy is slim to none. That's what it means. It doesn't mean you can't have seizure-free days or seizure-free periods, right? You can have seizure-free days and periods with refractory epilepsy, but what it
Yeah.
means is, in the grand scheme of things, maintenance of that freedom is probably going to be really hard to come by. So I think learning to say to yourself, I don't have control of what happens, and then learning to say or to think about what you do have control over. So for me, I have control over asking questions to learn more, to help me make decisions. That is something that has helped me as I've learned to do that through him growing and us interacting with his neurologist is to try and get as much information as I can to help me make the best decisions that I can, knowing that there are no right and wrong decisions and there
Yep.
are no answers. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll follow us on social media at CDKL5 in Color on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and visit us online at cdkl5incolor.com. Have questions or a topic you'd like us to chat about? Would you like to be a guest on our podcast? Email us, cdkl5incolor@gmail.com, and we'll be in touch. Until next time.